Think about the heroes of World War I. You probably picture soldiers in muddy trenches, brave pilots in dogfights, or generals poring over maps. But what if I told you the most powerful man in the war was unit on the battlefield at all? What if he was in a quiet, lavish office on Wall Street, holding the fate of entire nations in his hands? This is the story of a man who was not a soldier, a general, or a president. Yet he controlled the very lifeblood of the Allied war effort. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, Jr., the son of the legendary J.P. Morgan. When war broke out in 1914, Britain and France faced a catastrophic problem. They needed guns, bullets, food, and supplies on an unimaginable scale. Their factories couldn't keep up, so they turned to the industrial powerhouse of the world, America. But there was a catch. They needed to buy billions of dollars worth of goods, and they needed to pay in gold. Very quickly, their gold reserves began to vanish across the Atlantic. The British Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Their credit was shot. No one in America would lend them the money they desperately needed. Enter Jack Morgan. He inherited not just his father's immense fortune, but also his unparalleled influence. The British government, in a move of desperation, came to him with an unprecedented proposal: make the House of Morgan the sole purchasing agent for the entire British and French war effort in the United States. It was a deal of staggering proportions. Suddenly, Jack Morgan wasn't just a banker. He was the gatekeeper for billions of dollars in war contracts. Every rifle, every shell, every uniform bought in America had to go through him. This gave him immense power. He could choose which American companies got rich and which were left out. He coordinated a network of over 2,500 banks across the United States to fund the Allies. He was essentially running a private parallel treasury, propping up the finances of two of the world's greatest empires. Think about that for a moment. While soldiers waited for ammunition in the trenches of the Somme, their supply depended entirely on a single banker's ability to raise money thousands of miles away. If Jack Morgan failed, the Allied war machine would grind to a halt. But this wasn't just about business. It was deeply personal. Jack was a fierce Anglophile. He saw this as more than a financial transaction. It was a crusade to save Western civilization from German aggression. He put his firm, his reputation, and even his life on the line. In 1915, a man who opposed American involvement in the war broke into Morgan's home and shot him twice. Morgan survived, and the attack only strengthened his resolve. He worked tirelessly, organizing the largest foreign loan in history, up to that point a $500 million bond for the Allies. In today's money, that's over $13 billion. Through his efforts, the House of Morgan funneled an astonishing $3 billion to the Allies before America even entered the war. That's equivalent to nearly $80 billion today. He single-handedly kept Britain and France afloat. He wasn't just a banker. He was the quartermaster of the Western Front. While governments commanded armies, Jack Morgan commanded the credit that paid for them. It's a stark reminder that modern wars aren't just fought with courage and strategy. They are fought with credit, debt, and the staggering power of international finance. The story of World War I is incomplete without understanding the man in the Wall Street office who, for a time, was more powerful than a king. When the guns first roared across Europe in 1914, J.P. Morgan Jr. was a man living in a giant's shadow. His father, the legendary J.P. Morgan Sr., had died just a year before, leaving him an empire so vast it could move global markets with a whisper. But Jack, as he was known, was a different man, quieter, more cautious, and haunted by the fear that he could never fill his father's shoes. The weight of the world wasn't yet on his shoulders, but it was coming for him. He was still grieving when the first British diplomats arrived in New York, their hands trembling not from the autumn chill, but from sheer desperation. The British Empire, ruler of a quarter of the globe, was on the brink of financial collapse. They had run out of cash. Their gold reserves were draining. Their factories were slowing down, and their credit was evaporating. To fight a modern war, they needed everything: ammunition, food, steel, medicine, and they needed a financial lifeline that only one man in America could provide. Morgan listened silently as they laid out the terrifying truth. Britain's very survival depended on him. Not the U.S. government, which was officially neutral, not Congress. Him, a private banker. Behind his calm, collected expression, a storm of panic was brewing. What if he failed? What if this catastrophic war consumed his bank, shattered his reputation, and even damaged his country? The risks were unimaginable. But as the diplomats held their breath, he said one word. Yes. He would become the single most consequential yes in modern financial history. Without one word, a private citizen effectively took on the role of a niche. America was officially neutral, so Morgan had to operate in the shadows. He transformed his bank, J.P. Morgan & Co., from a financial institution into the central nervous system of the Allied war effort. He created a supply empire from scratch. He struck deals with tens of thousands of American factories, many of which had never produced military goods before. He organized shipping fleets, negotiated massive steel contracts, coordinated with railroads to move goods to the coasts, and approved purchases so large they dwarfed the national budgets of many countries. Soon, an astonishing fact became reality. More than 80% of everything the Allies bought in the United States flowed through one single office on Wall Street. His office, long before the U.S. government stepped in, a private banker had quietly become the arsenal of democracy. America didn't know it yet, but its industrial might was already at war, orchestrated by one man. The scale was staggering. By 1917, Morgan had funneled over $3 billion in supplies to Britain and France. In today's money, that's like a single person managing a transaction of over $70 billion. He wasn't just a banker anymore. He was a quartermaster to the world. But Morgan's world wasn't just numbers and contracts. It was a world of human consequence. Behind every decision were real people, living and dying with the results of his work. One of those people was Samuel Harris, a young clerk at the Morgan Bank. Samuel was bright, ambitious, and the child of immigrants who saw the bank's marble lobby as a temple of American opportunity. He watched from the inside as his boss, the quiet Mr. Morgan, transformed into a wartime commander, and he saw the immense toll it took. The late nights became all-nighters. The once approachable financier became more isolated, consumed by the crushing responsibility. Samuel saw the quiet moments the public never witnessed. He saw Morgan staring at casualty reports sent from the trenches in Europe. These weren't required reading for a banker, but Morgan felt a moral duty to understand the human cost of the checks he was signing. For Samuel and the thousands of other workers swept up in this effort, the war meant endless overtime trains arriving at dawn packed with paperwork and the quiet, heavy knowledge that every signature they processed might send food to an exhausted soldier or shells into a battlefield they would never see. They were cogs in a machine, but a machine that was keeping an entire side of the war alive. As the war intensified and Morgan's operation grew, so did the suspicion and anger back home. America was deeply divided. Many saw the war as a European problem and wanted no part of it. Newspapers began accusing Morgan of being a warmonger, a profiteer, trying to drag America into the conflict just to line his own pockets. Protesters gathered outside his home, their signs branding him an enemy of peace. A man once respected as a pillar of American stability was now a target of public outrage. Then came the official threats. The German embassy issued a chilling, public warning. American financiers who aided the Allies would pay a price. The war of words was about to become terrifyingly real. A few months later, on a busy morning at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, a horse-drawn cart filled with dynamite and iron sash weights exploded directly in front of the J.P. Morgan & Co. headquarters. The blast was catastrophic. Bodies lay scattered across the cobblestones, windows shattered 4 blocks, raining glass down on the financial district. It was the single deadliest terrorist attack in New York's history until September 11th, 2001. Morgan himself survived, but the message was brutally clear. The war was no longer an abstract problem across the ocean. It had arrived at his doorstep, written in blood and fire. The man who was supposed to remain neutral, a detached financier, now found himself standing at the very center of the world's most dangerous conflict, a target for enemies both at home and abroad. The war had come for J.P. Morgan Jr., and it would demand a price he never could have imagined. His quiet life was over, and the future of the Western world rested, in no small part, on his next move. By 1916, the Great War wasn't just a meat grinder for soldiers. It was a black hole for money. It was swallowing resources faster than any nation on Earth could possibly supply. For the Allied powers, the situation was catastrophic. Great Britain, the world's banker for a century, had finally run out of gold. France was utterly exhausted. Its treasury bled dry. Even the seemingly bottomless credit lines of J.P. Morgan Jr., the man who had become the Allies' personnel financier, were stretched to the breaking point. The war had no mercy, and it had no budget. Then came the moment that changed everything. In a hushed, desperate meeting, the British ambassador delivered a chilling message to Morgan. The news was stark. Without an immediate, massive infusion of cash, the entire Allied war effort could collapse. Not in months, but in weeks. In that instant, Morgan must have felt the floor drop out from under him. The implications were staggering. If the Allies fell, it wasn't just about a redrawn map of Europe. The entire American economy, which had been booming by supplying the war, could crash into a depression. His own bank, the most powerful financial institution in the world, would be ruined, holding billions in worthless Allied debt. His nation, the United States, could find itself isolated in a world dominated by a victorious and hostile German empire. The panic was real, but underneath it, Morgan understood a deeper truth. He had become too big to fail. Not just his bank, but him, the man. Entire governments were now utterly dependent on his signature. The industries of a dozen nations relied on his financial network. And on the battlefields of France and Belgium, millions of soldiers were fighting with rifles, wearing boots, and eating bread, all purchased through his vast lines of credit. He wasn't just a banker anymore. He was a logistical cornerstone of the largest conflict in human history. So he made the decision that would define his legacy. He resolved to do something that had never been done before. He would organize the largest public bond sale in history. He would ask ordinary Americans, farmers in Iowa, shopkeepers in Ohio, factory workers in Pittsburgh to lend their personal savings to a brutal, foreign war that their own country had not even officially joined. It was an audacious, almost insane idea. Why would anyone risk their life savings on a gamble like that? Morgan, the titan of Wall Street, the man so often vilified as a greedy monopolist, embarked on a nationwide campaign. He traveled across the country, not with grand pronouncements, but with quiet, passionate speeches. He spoke about stability, about duty, and about the shared future of the free world. The same crowds that had once despised him as the symbol of everything wrong with capitalism now gathered and listened. Spellbound, he wasn't selling them a stock. He was selling them a stake in civilization itself. And against all odds, the impossible happened. The American people responded. More than $1 billion, an almost unimaginable sum, at the time flowed from main streets across America into the Allied war effort. A fictional character, let's call him Samuel Harris, a junior analyst watching from the sidelines, would have seen the true nature of Morgan's power. He would realize that this empire wasn't built from gold bullion or steel mills. It was built from something far more valuable and far more fragile. Trust. Millions of tiny threads of trust woven together from countless individual investors, forming a rope strong enough to pull entire nations back from the brink of annihilation. But this immense responsibility was changing Morgan. The war wasn't an abstract financial transaction for him anymore. He had read too many casualty lists sent from the front. He had personally comforted too many grieving families who had lost sons and husbands. He had seen the grim newsreels and felt the tremors of a world tearing itself apart. He no longer saw himself as just a banker. He was a participant, bearing a weight few could comprehend. The numbers on his ledgers had faces, and the interest paid was measured in blood. When America finally declared war in April 1917, Morgan fully expected the U.S. government to turn to him. He assumed he would be asked to manage the nation's wartime purchasing, just as he had so effectively for the Allies. After all, who else had the experience, the network, the sheer financial power to mobilize the American economy for total war? Instead, he was sidelined. Politicians in Washington, wary of his immense influence, feared him. They believed that one man had come too close to controlling the destiny of nations, and they were determined to reclaim that power. For the first time in years, J.P. Morgan Jr., the most powerful private citizen in the world, felt irrelevant. The government created its own committees, its own purchasing boards, and ran its own Liberty Bond drives, consciously cutting him out. But alongside the sting of rejection, Morgan felt something else, something unexpected, relief, a profound, bone-deep relief. Because he knew, in his heart, that he had already done his part. He had held the line. He had kept the Allies alive long enough for the full might of the United States to arrive and tip the scales. His empire of credit had been the lifeline when the world was drowning. When the armistice was finally signed on November 11th, church bells rang out from London to Paris to New York. Crowds erupted in jubilant celebration. Soldiers wept and embraced strangers in the streets. But in his quiet office on Wall Street, J.P. Morgan Jr. sat alone. He stared at a ledger, a book filled with numbers that represented not profit, but cost. The astronomical costs of the war, measured not just in dollars and debt, but in human lives, in sleepless nights, in the quiet sacrifices of millions. He must have wondered if history would ever understand what he had done. Did he save the world, or did he simply purchase more time at an unbearable price? Our fictional observer, Samuel Harries, might have later written in his diary, "He was the most powerful man I ever met, and the loneliest." In the decades that followed, the legend of J.P. Morgan's wartime financial empire began to fade. History textbooks celebrated the generals and the presidents, the heroes of the battlefield and the State House. They forgot the financier who kept their armies fed, clothed, and armed. But his story remains a powerful reminder of a fundamental truth. Wars may be fought by soldiers, but they are survived because of ordinary people, the workers, the clerks, the farmers who choose against all fear to believe in a better tomorrow. And sometimes, the fate of the entire world rests not in the hands of a man with a gun, but in the hands of someone who never fires a single shot. That is the forgotten legacy of the banker who, for a brief, terrifying moment in history, both saved and owned World War I. Thank you for watching. If you found this hidden story of history fascinating, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more forgotten tales. See you next time.